Yeah, we're gonna be here a while. As I'm recording this, it's absolutely incredible to me that we are just about a month away from Wayne Gretzky's 60th birthday. And if you're a hockey fan, young or old, recent or a lifer, you've probably picked up at least on bits and pieces of the Great One's story. Born January 26, 1961 in Brantford, Ontario, Wayne Gretzky was just this fun-loving kid who happened to learn skating at a young age and excelled pretty well. And he always seemed to be playing against kids who were much older than him, and as he got older, he got even better at hockey. To the point where he found himself one day during the 1977-78 season on the Ontario Hockey Association's Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds, where in just 64 games, Wayne Gretzky scored 70 goals, 112 assists for 182 points. 14 penalty minutes though, I mean, where's the discipline? Obviously a phenom in the making, but still too young for the NHL, Wayne Gretzky ends up in the fizzling rival of the NHL in the WHA. To start the 78-79 season, Gretzky is with the Indianapolis Racers, and he puts up 6 points in 8 games, and then the Racers fold. The Racers got this teenage phenom thinking he would be this huge draw and fans would pack the stands, and they just didn't, so they decided to cease operations. That's when the story gets absurd, because there is a video on this very YouTube channel talking about the day that Wayne Gretzky almost became a member of the Winnipeg Jets. Now, the alleged story that sounds a little bit more like an urban legend is that Wayne Gretzky was won by the Edmonton Oilers away from the Winnipeg Jets in a game of backgammon. You know, a perfectly normal thing to do. The truth, it appears, isn't quite as cartoony, but I think it's worse. The Racers straight up offered to sell Wayne Gretzky to the reigning WHA champion Winnipeg Jets, and they said no. What's worse, losing Gretzky in a game of backgammon, or actively saying, nah, I don't want a guy who's going to become the best hockey player of all time?
My GM at the time says, no, he's too skinny, he's too light, they'll kill him, and he can't play the whole schedule.
Rudy Pillow said that I couldn't play in the WHA, I couldn't play professional hockey, and he didn't want to do the deal.
I listened to him. Biggest mistake.
So, now Wayne Gretzky is a member of the WHA's Edmonton Oilers. And early returns were pretty good. 104 points, 43 of which were goals in 72 games. The next season, the Edmonton Oilers, along with Wayne Gretzky, joined the National Hockey League, and so begins the greatest career in NHL history. We're talking 8 consecutive 50-plus goal seasons, and to say 50-plus does not do it justice. His third season in the NHL, Wayne Gretzky scored 92 goals in 80 games, along with 212 points. Now, the 92 goal total is a record that still stands today. The 212 points in a season, however, is a record that would fall a few seasons later to a guy named, Wayne Gretzky, when he scored 215. This video is huge, but to do a video about all the records that Gretzky still holds today, I think would be even longer. The years go by, Gretzky gets better and better, and so do the Oilers, a legendary cast of future Hall of Famers on the roster, and they win 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups, 4 Stanley Cups by 1988. Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Yari Kurri, Glenn Anderson, Esa Tikkanen, Sportsnet's own Craig Simpson, Grant Fuhr in net. No one was stopping the Edmonton Oilers. And the Edmonton Oilers walk out of the building in 1988 holding the Stanley Cup. Gretzky individually walks out of the building holding the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP. And the trade rumors began the very next day. We need to go back in time about a decade from the 88 Stanley Cup win. Edmonton Oilers owner Peter Pocklington, he's on top of the moon. The Winnipeg Jets, they already said no to Wayne Gretzky. He didn't. He's got him. On Gretzky's 18th birthday in January 1979, the Oilers bring him out to center ice. They give him a nice birthday cake and a 21-year contract. The contract that Gretzky signed that night had 3 more years in it than Gretzky himself did at that point. And one thing within that contract is after 10 years, there was a renegotiation clause. Fast forward those 10 years, Wayne Gretzky has had tremendous success. The Edmonton Oilers have had tremendous success, but Peter Pocklington needs a little bit of money. One of the teams rumored to be in on Gretzky in '88 were the Vancouver Canucks. Can you imagine? Gretzky could have been on the Jets, on the Canucks. It's one of the biggest woulda, coulda, shouldas in the sports history. And then comes Los Angeles Kings owner Bruce McNall. If you watched our Eric Lindros trade tree video, there were all kinds of huge names. Peter Forsberg was in that deal too, but there was something in there that you just don't see these days. Cold, hard cash. And that is the most important thing that the LA Kings were able to offer the Edmonton Oilers to make this trade happen. Wayne Gretzky had a summer in 1988 that I don't think any of us can relate to. As we all know, he won the Stanley Cup, he got the Conn Smythe in the process, and not long after, he got married to famous actress Janet Jones. And Gretzky also had a friend named Alan Thicke, who happened to be a famous actor. And one day, August 9th, 1988 to be specific, Gretzky was house-sitting for Alan Thicke, and Alan's son Robin was there as well. Fun fact, a quarter century, 25 years later, Robin Thicke would release Blurred Lines, which would become like the biggest song in the world. That's just a fun little footnote in all this, but I'm burying the lead here. Something a lot more significant happened that day than house-sitting. Wayne Gretzky was traded. Before we get to the trade itself, I need to reiterate how absolutely fantastic Wayne Gretzky was as a member of the Edmonton Oilers. And for any of you watching this right now going, you don't need to explain that. Well, for some of the audience, I do. Myself, I was born in 1988. For me, growing up, I always knew Wayne Gretzky as a member of the LA Kings. So let me give you an idea of how prolific Wayne Gretzky was as an Oiler. Wayne Gretzky played 696 regular season games with the Edmonton Oilers. And during those 696 games, he scored 1,669 points. Don't rewind, you heard correctly, 1,669 points in 696 games. Don't bother busting out your calculator, I'll do it for you. That is 2.4 points per game. And it seems important to mention that 583 of those points or goals. If on that day, August 9th, 1988, Wayne Gretzky had refused to go to the LA Kings and instead said, I am retiring, with that point total alone, he would still be 8th in all-time NHL scoring today. Make absolutely no mistake about it, on that day, August 9th, 1988, the Edmonton Oilers were trading the best player in the sport. And because of that, on that day, everything changed. The saying, Wayne Gretzky was traded so anybody could be traded, is true. It's the biggest trade in hockey history, and some call it the biggest trade in sports history. The press conference announcing the trade was emotional, to say the least.
Promised Mess I wouldn't do this. But, as I said, there comes a time when
Despite heavy pushback from some members of Edmonton Oilers management, including then GM Glenn Sather, and a bid from members of the Canadian government trying to block the deal and keep Gretzky in Canada, the deal had gone too far. Wayne Gretzky was traded to the Los Angeles Kings, and the deal was as follows. The Edmonton Oilers acquire Jimmy Carson, Martin Gelinas, a first-round pick in 1989, a first-round pick in 1991, a first-round pick in 1993, and $15 million cash. While the LA Kings acquire Marty McSorley, Mike Krushelnyski, and Wayne Gretzky. Oilers fans hated this deal. The Oilers got 2 players and 3 picks, but no combination of any 5 players were ever going to make up for Wayne Gretzky in his prime. Well, what about the $15 million? If I'm a fan, what about the $15 million? It's not mine, is it? If I'm an Oilers fan, I don't care that Peter Pocklington's got another $15 million. He's not paying my car insurance. Pocklington would talk about getting shouted at by fans in the street and receiving death threats after the trade was made. But for the LA Kings, the impact was immediate and positive. Fans are calling the Kings off the hook, looking for seats. The building is packed for the first time in years. John McEnroe, Tom Hanks, all these celebrities are going. It's amazing that Tom Hanks was famous even back then. And Wayne Gretzky, while no longer scoring 92 goals in a season, was still the great one. Because the season before the Kings got Gretzky, they finished 20th out of 21 teams, which I believe is second last. I'm no mathematician. In his first season as an LA King, 78 games, Wayne Gretzky had 122 assists, 41 goals for 163 points. No longer second last in the league, the Kings rocket up the standings. They make the Stanley Cup playoffs, and in the first round of the 1989 Stanley Cup playoffs, the LA Kings take on, would you believe it, the Edmonton Oilers. And the Oilers, the battle-tested reigning champion Edmonton Oilers, were sticking it to the LA Kings, up 3-1 after 4. Wayne Gretzky throws up 7 points over the next 3 games. The LA Kings take game 5, 6, and 7 to pull off the 7-game comeback and defeat and eliminate the Edmonton Oilers. Second round, the Kings take on the Calgary Flames and swept, en route to a Calgary Flames Stanley Cup win in 1989. So if you're an Oilers fan, that's a tough spring and summer. Your Alberta rivals win the Stanley Cup after you were the reigning champions, and you were knocked off by the Great One in the first round in the first year after the trade. But it only added fuel to the fire for the Oilers. And using some of the pieces that they got in the Gretzky trade, they tinkered with the roster. For example, Jimmy Carson, who the Oilers got from the Kings in the Gretzky deal, was the second overall pick in 1986, and he was good, scoring 103 points in 84 games as an Oiler. That also meant he had value. So, early in the 1989-90 season, we have a trade to announce. The Edmonton Oilers trade Jimmy Carson, Kevin McClelland, and a 5th-round pick in 1991 to the Detroit Red Wings in return for Adam Graves, Peter Klima, Jeff Sharples, and Joe Murphy. Now, Jimmy Carson was the 2nd overall pick in 86. Joe Murphy in this deal was the 1st overall pick from 86. And Adam Graves was a 2nd-rounder from 86, but that wasn't as far back in the draft as it is today. He was only 22nd overall. During the 89-90 season, both Gelina and Murphy contributed 25 points to the Oilers, and Graves another 21. So not the star power of the Great One, but filling out the roster with some nice young depth. And let's not forget, the Oilers still had star power. Mark Messier posted a heroic 129 points, 45 of which were goals in 79 games that season. To give you an idea of how good that was, the next highest scorer on the Oilers was Yari Kurri with 93 points. And during the 1990 Stanley Cup playoffs, Messier and Craig Simpson throw up 31 points apiece in a single playoff run, and Bill Ranford, the new guy in goal, was a brick wall en route to an Edmonton Oilers Stanley Cup in 1990, just 2 seasons after Wayne Gretzky was traded. So, I've talked very little about the branches of the trade tree so far, but that's because this is so important. With the Eric Lindros trade tree, the Quebec Nordiques traded Lindros for all these futures, and we looked at how those helped build a Stanley Cup winning team, a multiple Stanley Cup winning team over the years, and how they built to it. Oilers fans can hate the Gretzky trade all they want, and maybe they should, but the fact of the matter is, the Oilers won the 1990 Stanley Cup without the Great One. If you want to talk about winners and losers, you want to talk about if the Oilers made a huge mistake with this trade, you cannot ignore the fact that they won a championship after the trade was made. You cannot ignore the fact that Joe Murphy, Martin Gelina, and Adam Graves contributed 13 goals during that run, and they came from this trade tree. Imagine the Penguins trading Crosby, the Capitals trading Ovechkin, the Oilers trading McDavid, and then winning the Stanley Cup just 2 seasons later. What happened after the 1990 Cup for the Oilers? Well, okay, fair point, and we'll get there. But did they win this Stanley Cup after the trade or not? Well, they would have won more cups with Gretzky. Listen, I think you're right, but we don't know that. I mean, listen, probably, but they didn't. The Gretzky trade was a collision of wants and needs. They wanted to win, but they needed the money. And in 1990, they got both. Just saying that, just throwing it out there. Now, let's start going through this tree, trade by trade. And just to give you an idea of what you're in for, there are 33 trades on the Oilers side, 21 on the Kings side, and yes, this tree is still going. So let's start. We'll get the easy stuff out of the way first. Adam Graves only had 46 points in 139 games as an Oiler, but he was young in his career. He would go on to have a very good one. In fact, he would sign as a free agent with the New York Rangers, where he would win another Stanley Cup with Mark Messier with the Rangers. Peter Klima, on the other hand, was traded, this time to the Tampa Bay Lightning, for a third-round pick in 1994. The Oilers selected Brad Symes. He never played in the NHL. Jeff Sharples is kind of an interesting one. Never did much in the NHL, but had a long AHL and IHL career, and the Oilers managed to trade him. And they traded him to the New Jersey Devils in exchange for Reijo Ruotsalainen, who was not a bad producer at all. 21 points in 26 games, but really just spent most of his career in Europe. Almost all of it. He had 2 different NHL stints, but Europe is where he stayed. Out of all the players that the Oilers got in exchange for Jimmy Carson, Joe Murphy stayed there the longest, playing 4 seasons, 210 games, putting up 179 points. He was a good Oiler. And the Oilers traded him to the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for Igor Kravchuk and Dean McCammon. This is one of those moments where I wish I could look through the screen and see all your reactions to the names. Because I imagine the reactions are somewhere between Igor Kravchuk, yeah, and who the heck is that? And the further we go down this trade tree, the closer to the present we're going to get. Except in this case, where to advance in this trade tree, we actually have to go backwards. Martin Gelinas, we've already talked about him. He won the Stanley Cup with the Oilers in 1990, and he was the 7th overall pick in 1988. He had 120 points in 258 games as a hard-working forward. The point total doesn't really speak to his impact. This guy was a problem on the ice and was for years afterward. But down the line, the Oilers would trade Gelinas. The deal was Martin Gelinas and a 6th-round pick in 1993 going to the Quebec Nordiques for Scott Pearson. Pearson, another guy, not a huge contributor, but still solid, 42 points in 100 games for the Oilers. But the Oilers end up flipping him too, this time to the Buffalo Sabres for Ken Sutton, who only played 44 games for the team. And now you'll see why we had to go backwards. Igor Kravchuk, hey, I remember that guy, you talked about him just a minute ago. 88 points in 160 games as an Oilers defenseman. He was great with the puck, was packaged with Ken Sutton in a deal. Those two were sent to the St. Louis Blues in exchange for defenseman Jeff Norton and defenseman Donald Dufresne. Dufresne played 64 games for the Oilers, Norton played 92. I've done a lot of these trade trees, and there are many ways to measure success. Winning a championship is obviously paramount. You want to get star players for sure, but what if you never win with them? But beyond winning a championship, beyond getting star players, you just want games played. You want service. The worst thing that can happen to you in a trade tree is it just stops. So watch this. After 92 games, the Oilers sent Jeff Norton to the Tampa Bay Lightning for Drew Bannister and a 6th-round pick in 1997. The Oilers selected forward Peter Sarno. He only played 6 games for the Oilers. He was traded for goaltender Tyler Moss with the Vancouver Canucks, who didn't play any games for the Oilers. But Bannister, 35 games for the Oilers, sent to the Anaheim Ducks for Bobby Dallas. Dallas played 30 games for the Oilers. He was packaged with Tony Herkis and sent to the Pittsburgh Penguins for Joseph Baranek, who played 208 games for the Oilers, putting up 102 points. After that, he was sent to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Hey, look, another Pittsburgh deal for German Titov. Just 7 games for the Oilers, unfortunately. Why do we care about German Titov, who barely played for the Oilers? Well, the Oilers got him as a deadline pickup in 2000 for the 2000 Stanley Cup playoffs. He only played 5 games, put up a goal and an assist, oh well. But the Oilers got 5 games of service, a goal and an assist in the 2000 Stanley Cup playoffs directly from the Wayne Gretzky Trade tree in 1988. 12 years prior. And while that's the end of that particular branch of the Gretzky trade tree, we're not done by a long shot. Even though a lot of the players that we've discussed so far only stuck around for a cup of coffee with Edmonton, a bunch stuck around for 200 plus games. Peter Klima was almost 300. All the players that we've mentioned so far have added up to over 1,300 games played for the Oilers, and we've barely scratched the surface on this thing. So with that being said, let's continue. And to do that, we gotta go back up to Joe Murphy. As we said, Joe Murphy was an Oiler for over 200 NHL games, and then he was traded for Igor Kravchuk and Dean McCammon. We've already covered Kravchuk. What about McCammon? Well, McCammon was a former first-round pick of the Chicago Blackhawks, and that's where he was traded next. Back to the Blackhawks. Man, it's something they've been doing for a long time, isn't it? Dean McCammon was sent back to the Chicago Blackhawks in a package that included defenseman Jonas Elofsson, defenseman Boris Mironov, and a second-round pick in 1999 in exchange for Daniel Cleary, Chad Kilger, Ethan Morrow, Christian Laflamme, and a second-round pick in 1999. Ignoring the fact that a bunch of those names are guys who played in the NHL pretty recently, 1999, that's 11 years after the initial Gretzky trade. For any Oilers fans anxious about the second-round pick that they gave up in 99 in this trade, don't worry, Dmitry Levinsky, not a superstar. In this deal with Chicago, wow, did the Oilers get a lot of use out of it. Daniel Cleary, not exactly a prolific scorer with the Edmonton Oilers, just 86 points, but 220 games. Chad Kilger, former 4th overall pick, kind of disappointing, just 14 points in 87 games as an Oiler. But the Oilers were able to ship him to Montreal in exchange for Sergei Zholtok. He was only there for 37 games, but he put up 20 points. Zholtok was later flipped for a 7th rounder to Minnesota. Unfortunately, that player never played in the NHL. So again, not a ton of star power, but okay, you're getting games played. Give me a name though, give me a name. Well, how's this for a name? Ethan Morrow played 653 games with the Edmonton Oilers after this trade with the Chicago Blackhawks, and would eventually be the Edmonton Oilers captain. Dude, that is a win, an easy win in that trade with the Chicago Blackhawks, and we're not even done yet. To get a guy with over 600 games played for your team, and he was a captain, that's fantastic work. Also from that deal with the Chicago Blackhawks that gave the Oilers Ethan Morrow, they got Christian Laflamme, a defenseman who played 61 games for the Oilers. He was packaged with Matthew Descoteaux down the line and sent to the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for 2 defensemen, Igor Ulanov and Alain Nesradin. Now, Ulanov is nothing to sneeze at. He ended up playing 160 games with the Oilers organization. Alain Nesradin played no games for the Edmonton Oilers, but if you're like, why do I recognize that name? That's because he is the current head coach of the New Jersey Devils. He's not the only coach in this trade tree either. He's not even the only head coach, but you'll see that down the line. And the Oilers turned that 2nd round pick that they got from the Chicago Blackhawks into defenseman Alexei Semenov, 103 games played with the Oilers. He was then traded to the Florida Panthers for a 5th. Brian Pitton never played in the NHL. Once again, star power is wonderful, and winning would be even better. But out of just that one deal with the Chicago Blackhawks, the Edmonton Oilers got over 1,300 games of service in the NHL. The Edmonton Oilers got 5 pieces back in exchange for Wayne Gretzky in that trade with the Kings in 1988. 2 of those pieces were players, and those players led to 17 trades. Now, both the Jimmy Carson and Martin Gelinas branches of the Wayne Gretzky trade tree are done. There's still 3 more left for the Oilers though. 2 are pretty simple, 1 not so much. So let's start with the simple ones. Good players are often traded for big prospects, big 1st round picks. And it's a shame because those guys are at the youngest, most vulnerable parts of their careers, and they have this unbelievable expectation attached to their name because of who they were traded for. So imagine getting traded for Wayne Gretzky. Now imagine being one of the 1st round picks that was traded for Wayne Gretzky, but you were like 13 years old when the trade happened. That is the case for the Edmonton Oilers' 1st round pick in 1993, Nick Stadstuhar. 16th overall, that is not nothing at all. Unfortunately for Stadstuhar, just 2 games in an Edmonton Oilers uniform and 2 games in the NHL. He had a decent little pro career, the AHL, ECHL, IHL, CHL, but never again in the NHL after those 2 games. And this is the problem with those picks in these deals. If you hit on them, you look like a genius, and the deal was worth it. If you miss, you stink. It's kind of unfair. It's like pitting your amateur scouts against your pro ones. So I tell you, the Oilers get a 16th overall pick in 1993 in exchange for Wayne Gretzky, and he only played 2 games. And you tell me that's a disaster, that stinks, that trade is stupid. And I tell you, you're right. But what if, instead, with the 16th overall pick in 1993, the Oilers pick the guy who went 17th, Jason Allison, who went over 500 games in the NHL. Or imagine this, the Oilers picked the guy who went 21st in 1993. Do you know who that was? Saku Koivu. Or, imagine how different the Canadian hockey landscape would be if the Oilers picked the guy who went 23rd in 1993, Todd Bertuzzi. And I'm cherry picking the biggest names, but even some guys who went relatively soon after the 16th pick, Kevin Adams, who's now the GM of the Buffalo Sabres, Scott Langkow, Jay Pandolfo, Jamie Langenbrunner. Any one of those guys were having a completely different conversation, but the Oilers get 5 assets for Wayne Gretzky, apart from the money, and they completely whiff on this one. Just 2 NHL games played. Not good. And they weren't even able to flip them. So, the Oilers only get 2 NHL games played out of Stade du Har. They only got 2 NHL games played out of another one of their first-round picks too, except this one was a mistake to trade. Because in 1991, 20th overall, the Edmonton Oilers select Martin Rucinski. He had a 16-season, nearly 1,000-game NHL career, and the Oilers had him for 2 of those games. They traded Rucinski to the Quebec Nordiques in exchange for goaltender Ron Tugnut and Brad Savisha. Tugnut played 29 games for the Oilers, and he had a decent NHL career, but the Oilers lost him after just 29 games. In the expansion draft, he went to the Anaheim Mighty Ducks. Spoiler alert, not the last time the expansion draft would bite the Oilers in this thing. And Brad Savisha, after just 2 games with the Oilers, was packaged with a 6th-round pick in 1995 and sent to the Philadelphia Flyers in exchange for Ryan McGill. And if you don't know who that is, that's because he just played the 8 games. Oh, think of how different things could have been. Imagine the Oilers keep Martin Rucinski for almost 1,000 NHL games, and in 1993, they draft Saku Koivu to boot. We're talking about a completely different Edmonton Oilers team throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. They could keep those guys and they would flourish in Edmonton and have great careers. They could let them develop a bit and show the world that they're great and then trade them for even more assets, or instead they could flub one pick and trade the other for next to nothing. Ugh. Now there's one more first rounder that the Oilers got in exchange for Wayne Gretzky, and this pick was kind of flubbed too. However, it wasn't the Oilers who flubbed it. That first round pick in 1989 was traded to the New Jersey Devils in exchange for Corey Foster, straight up. So that's interesting. Corey Foster was the 12th overall pick in 1988. So it's a guy who's a little further on in his development, but he hasn't exactly blown the doors off. On the other hand, the Oilers trade to the New Jersey Devils Magic Beans. Now, Foster didn't end up playing a game for the Edmonton Oilers. That's not very good. But luckily for the Edmonton Oilers, Jason Miller only played 6 NHL games, all with the Devils, before going to the minors. Oilers fans shouldn't be like, good, just because the pick that was sent to the New Jersey Devils didn't work out for the Devils. Because that pick was 18th overall. That's valuable. What if the Oilers keep that 1989 first-round pick, and instead of drafting Jason Miller 18th overall, they take the player who went 19th, goaltender Olaf Kolzig. No big deal, just Oli the goalie, winner of the Vezina Trophy in the year 2000. He had a wonderful NHL career. Imagine him in an Oilers uniform for all those years. Who knows? Now, so far in this trade tree, all the trades that we've seen have been direct. This trade happened because of this trade, and this player because of this. This is a little shoehorned, but it's a fun footnote, because Corey Foster, who the Oilers got for this first-round pick in 1989 from the Devils, he was traded in a package, but he wasn't the principal part of the package, which is why there's like a little asterisk on it. It's no small trade though. The Oilers trade Corey Foster, Dave Brown, who was just a big old pair of fists, and Yari Kurri to the Philadelphia Flyers in exchange for Craig Fisher, Scott Mellenby, and Craig Berube. So there's a few things going on here. Number one, yes, Wayne Gretzky was traded, but it didn't stop the Oilers from winning a Stanley Cup 2 years later. However, getting rid of Yari Kurri, all right, now the sun is setting on what was the 80s Oilers. Number two, Craig Berube is in the trade. I know that guy. He coaches the Blues now. And number three, we are going to initiate freelance editor Tom's favorite, the speed round. Because listen, Corey Foster is the connection to the rest of this branch of the trade tree. However, with this deal, because he's not the principal part of the deal, it's Yari Kurri, it's shoehorned. Jimmy Carson getting dealt to Detroit. Jimmy Carson is a meaty part of that deal. Corey Foster was one of 3 guys traded to the Flyers in this deal, and he was probably the 3rd most important. So that's why we're doing speed round. Get ready. I'm gonna take a big breath. 3, 2, one. Once again, the deal was Corey Foster, Dave Brown, and Yari Kurri to the Philadelphia Flyers in exchange for Craig Fisher, Scott Mellanby, and Craig Berube. Craig Fisher was traded to the Winnipeg Jets in exchange for cash considerations, and Scott Mellanby was lost to the expansion draft, oh no, to the Florida Panthers. And what a shame for the Oilers there. Mellanby would go on to be the captain of the Florida Panthers, even seeing them to the Stanley Cup final in 1996, over 500 games. Great player. Craig Berube, no games with the Oilers, but he was packaged with two other guys who were part of the glory days, Glenn Anderson and Grant Fuhr, and sent to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for future considerations: Scott Thornton, Peter Ing, Luke Richardson, and Vincent Domfus. Future considerations are the hardest thing to find for these trade trees, and more often than not, they're nothing, and it looks like that was the case here. Scott Thornton, on the other hand, over 200 games with the Edmonton Oilers. He was later traded to the Montreal Canadiens for Andrei Kovalenko, who was traded to the Philadelphia Flyers for Alexander Daig, and then on the same day, Alexander Daig was traded to the Tampa Bay Lightning for Alex Solovanov. Solovanov played 96 games for the Oilers, which is more than nothing. Peter Ing, he only played a short cup of coffee with the Edmonton Oilers. He was later traded for a 7th round pick who never ended up playing for the team. Luke Richardson, no trade to report there, but on the other hand, he was a hard-nosed defenseman for the Oilers for over 400 games. That's great value. Vincent Domfus, playing one really good season with the Oilers, 89 points in 80 games. He was packaged with a 4th round pick in 1993 and sent to the Montreal Canadiens in exchange for Shane Corson, Brent Gilchrist, and Vladimir Vujitek. Shane Corson played just under 200 games with the Oilers, and for the 94-95 lockout-shortened season, he was even their captain. Brent Gilchrist only played 60 games with the Oilers. He was later traded to the Minnesota Wild for Todd Ellick, who only played a cup of coffee with the Oil. He actually spent most of his career with LA, ironically. Vujitek was packaged with a 3rd round pick in 1998 and sent to the Tampa Bay Lightning in exchange for Brant Myers and a 3rd round pick in 1998, and then Myers was sent to the Philadelphia Flyers for Jason Bowen, the 15th overall pick in 1992, only 4 NHL games played. Which ends this trade tree, thank goodness. Nope, wait a sec, no, I'm wrong, it only ends the Oilers half. Thankfully, that's it for the speed round. Let's just put a bow on that. So the Oilers half of the Gretzky trade tree, it's done. They're not getting any more dividends from that. All the names we just mentioned are cool and like, oh, you got a season out of Vinny Domfus, but like we said, shoehorned in. Jason Miller was traded for Corey Foster. Corey Foster, only a small part of the deal he was involved in that led to all the things I just mentioned in the speed round. Nick Stajduhar, like we said, 2 NHL games for the Oilers. The 1st round pick in 1991 that turned into Martin Rucinski, kind of the guy who got away there. But from the Martin Gelinas and Jimmy Carson trades alone, the Oilers got somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 games played. And you might say, yeah, that's great, and Gelinas was fine, and Jimmy Carson was fine, and Adam Graves and all that, they were fine. They weren't Gretzky, they weren't stars. And the thing I will not let go of, they won the Cup in 1990. They won the Cup 2 seasons after trading Gretzky, which is legendarily heroic. But of course, if the LA Kings go on to win all kinds of Stanley Cups with Wayne Gretzky, the trade's gonna look a lot worse. So, is that what happened? Once again, the LA Kings got Marty McSorley, Mike Krushelnyski, and Wayne Gretzky from the Edmonton Oilers. Let's start with Mike Krushelnyski, because his is the easiest branch. Now, Krushelnyski, aka Crusher, was a good contributor for the Kings, 109 points in just over 150 games. I've also played with him at several charity tournaments, and I can tell you he still has the energy of an 8-year-old on pixie sticks. But the LA Kings only had Crusher for those 156 games before he was traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs. It was a 1-for-1 deal in which the LA Kings got another forward, John McIntyre. Now, McIntyre did not put up nearly the points that Krushelnyski did, just 44 in 178 games, but 178 game service, that's not bad. McIntyre was later packaged and sent to the New York Rangers in exchange for a 5th round pick in 1993, who never went on to play in the NHL, and defenseman Mark Hardy. Awesome value for the LA Kings, 303 points in 616 games. Woo! Even though the Kings didn't hit on that 1993 draft pick that they got in this deal, they did do something else in 1993. Do you remember what it was? They finally made it to the Stanley Cup final with Wayne Gretzky at the helm. Which is weird, because I had actually read that the LA Kings lost in 6 games in round 3 to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Something about Gretzky taking a really costly penalty that was the reason that his team ended up losing. I wrote about it somewhere. It's here. It's in my notes. Oh, actually, it's from my therapist. Steve, you were 5 when this happened, let it go. Okay, fair point, Doc. Now that you mention it, the Carey Fraser voodoo doll does seem a bit much. We don't have an all-Canadian matchup in 1993 between the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Montreal Canadiens. Instead, we have Wayne Gretzky and the LA Kings. This is probably better for hockey, taking on the Montreal Canadiens. Speaking of better for hockey, who knows what happens to hockey if the Kings win it all that year? We already have the Sharks and Ducks. Do you think the Sharks and Ducks are in the NHL if Gretzky never becomes a King? The amount of NHL players, NHL draft picks, especially first rounders, coming out of traditionally non-traditional hockey markets that are hot all year round. Gretzky's mere presence helped bring these things, helped grow the game. Imagine if the Kings had won the cup. Unfortunately for them, not so much. In fact, another part of this trade tree, Marty McSorley has a little bit of a footnote in that. Remember the illegal curve that he got called for? Ooh, I'm sure Kings fans remember. Wayne Gretzky gave the Los Angeles Kings basically everything he could except the Stanley Cup. His goal-scoring touch had taken a hit, 246 goals in 539 games with the Kings, but in those 539 games, 918 points. The guy still knew hockey. After 8 years with the LA Kings, though, it was time for the Great One to move on, and he was dealt to the St. Louis Blues. And Oilers fans, if you're mad about the Gretzky trade to LA, I'm here to tell you it's not even the worst Gretzky trade. Because the Kings trade with the Blues stinks. Because Gretzky was traded to the Blues for 5 assets. Do you want to hear them? They were Craig Johnson, Patrice Tardif, Roman Vopat, a first-round pick in 1997, and a 5th-round pick in 1996. The 5th-round pick in 96, Peter Hogan, never played in the NHL, but it's a 5th-rounder. You can't rely on that. Fair game. The 1st-rounder in 97, this one is painful. Because 15th overall, the Kings select Matt Zoltek. And you're probably wondering, who is that? And that's because he never ended up with the Kings. In fact, he went back into the draft, and in 99, he was a 2nd rounder for the Bruins. And any Bruins fans might be like, sorry, who is that? He didn't really play for you either. He bounced around the minors his whole career and played in the SPHL as recently as 2011, but 15th overall pick? Whew. Guys picked after Zoltek in the 1st round of 97 include defenseman Scott Hannon and forward Brendan Morrow. Oh, imagine the difference in complexion of the Western Conference over so many years if the Kings get him. So the Kings get 5 assets from the Blues, 2 of them were picks, no games played from either of them. There's also forward Patrice Tardif, who played only 15 games for the Kings, but in his defense, it's 15 more than the Kings have gotten so far. Then there's winger Craig Johnson, who ended up playing 429 games with the Kings. Okay, that's not nothing. The guy wasn't exactly a star, but that's not nothing. It's maybe not the greatest return in the world for Gretzky, but it's something. And then there's forward Roman Vopat, the only guy out of the 5 that the Kings got for Gretzky who ended up getting dealt. Lacroix would end up playing 144 games with the Kings, that's not bad, and then sent to the New York Rangers for Sean Pronger. Oh, I'm sorry, did you want me to continue? There's nothing else. For as long as the Gretzky trade tree is, the fact that he was traded again, this time by the LA Kings, oh, this thing should go on for hours and hours and hours, except the Kings got almost nothing in exchange for this guy. The most value the Kings got out of the Gretzky trade with the Blues was from Craig Johnson. Oilers fans, is your heart growing 3 sizes today? So we've already done Crusher, we've already done Gretzky. Oh, maybe we should talk about how Gretzky's stint in St. Louis went. 21 points in 18 regular season games. That's all he played in St. Louis, but that's not why the Blues got him. They got him for the playoffs. Well, they played the Detroit Red Wings, and in double overtime, Game 7, Steve Yzerman did this. I still say it's the best camera work ever done on an NHL goal, and did you happen to notice the player that Yzerman collected the puck from? Wayne Gretzky. That jersey's sick though. Reverse retro. Or I guess literal retro. Now, the rest of this trade tree would be quick and over with were it not for Marty McSorley. He just had to keep it going. Marty McSorley, to say the least, is one of the most feared pair of fists to ever skate in the National Hockey League. He played 412 games with the Kings and put up 234 points, but no one cares about that because he put up over 1,800 penalty minutes just with the Kings. Don't bother looking it up, I got you. That is 4.48 penalty minutes per game. That is basically 4.5 penalty minutes per game for Marty McSorley. You could basically bank on him fighting every time you showed up. I should mention, however, Marty McSorley's 412 games with the Kings were not all in one stint. Because at one point, Marty McSorley was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins for winger Sean McEachern. Sean McEachern, good little NHL career. Ottawa Senators fans would know him very well. But for some reason, the McSorley mix in Pittsburgh and the McEachern mix in LA didn't work, and only a few months later, they were traded for each other again. But the trade was a little different this time. McEachern was packaged with another really underrated player, I thought, Thomas Sandstrom, and sent back to the Pittsburgh Penguins for Marty McSorley and Jim Pake. This spreads into two more branches. One is very large, one is very small. Let's do the small one first. Jim Pake was traded to the Ottawa Senators for his 7th round pick in 1995. Benoit LaRose, 157th overall. Marty McSorley involved in a much bigger deal because he got traded again. McSorley was packaged with Shane Churla and Yari Kurri this time. There was a lot of back and forth with Kurri, and sent to the New York Rangers for, are you ready for this? Matthias Norstrom, Nathan Lafayette, Ian LaPerriere, Ray Ferraro, and a 4th round pick in 1997. Huge deal. Let's go over the easy stuff first. The 4th round pick in 97, Sean Blanchard. He didn't play with the Kings, but he played all over the world, had a nice little career. Ray Ferraro, 98 points in 197 games with the Kings. That's certainly not nothing. Ian LaPerriere, you might be saying, hey, that's the assistant coach in Philly. And I would say, oh my God, you're a child. No, in his playing day, Ian LaPerriere was hell on skates. Just under 600 games with the Kings and just over 100 points. So what do you think he was doing? Nathan Lafayette, only 94 games with the Kings, and then he retired. So the Kings got 5 guys out of that deal we just mentioned. The first 4 that we just talked about were never traded, but the 5th guy, one of the more underratedly impactful guys in this entire trade tree, Matthias Norstrom, a no-guff defender who played 11 years with the LA Kings, 780 games with the team, and he was their captain for a long time. He was their captain from 2001 to 2007. Reminder, this trade tree begins in 1988. And this is what trade trees need to flourish. This is the soil. You need a huge deal, happens in 88, and then you need just one player who has a real long career and then gets traded. Norstrom is our guy who keeps this going. Because after his 780 games with the Kings, he gets dealt. Matthias Norstrom gets packaged with Konstantin Pushkarev, a 3rd round pick in 2007, and a 4th round pick in 2007. We're all the way in 2007. They all get dealt to Dallas for a 1st round pick in 2008, a 2nd round pick in 2007, a 3rd round pick in 2007, Johan Franzen, no, not the guy from the Red Wings, a different guy with different spelling, and defender Yaroslav Modry. Modry, another one of those guys, he wasn't a superstar, but over 450 games for the Kings. This guy had an NHL career. He's another guy who really could have kept this trade tree going. He ends up getting dealt for a 3rd round pick, but unfortunately that pick never ended up playing in the NHL, so we end there with that little branch. Johan Franzen, once again, no, he's not Mule from the Detroit Red Wings. He's a former 2nd round pick of the Dallas Stars. Never played an NHL game though, although he is still playing in Sweden today. Isn't that amazing? Even though he never played an NHL game, there is a guy from the Gretzky Trade in '88 who's still playing professional hockey this season. It's amazing anyone's playing professional hockey this season. The 3rd round pick in 2007, Brian Cameron, never played in the NHL. So, okay, if this is your first trade tree, I gotta tell you what's about to happen here. We already know the Oilers half of the trade tree does not continue. We already know that we've already talked about everything with Gretzky's branch and with Krushelnyski's branch. If McSorley's branch ends, it's over. This trade tree's done. The 2nd round pick in 2007, Oscar Moeller, yeah, he played a little bit with the LA Kings, and yes, he's playing in Sweden right now, but he is no longer with the Kings. We only have one more hope to keep this tree going. And sure enough, that 1st round pick, the 28th overall pick in 2008, was dealt. In fact, it was packaged with another 1st rounder in 2008, the 17th overall pick, and sent to the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for the 12th overall pick in 2008. And you want to know who the Kings picked with that pick? They didn't! The Kings traded the 12th overall pick to the Buffalo Sabres in exchange for the 13th overall pick in 2008, so they're moving down one spot, and a 3rd round pick in 2009. And both those picks take us in two very different directions to end this trade tree. Because with that pick, the Kings get Colton Tubert, a huge defenseman, played for Team Canada at the World Juniors, but sort of played in the wrong era. But he would be part of a key deadline package for the Kings, ironically going to where else? Edmonton to play on the Oilers. The deal was Colton Tubert, a 1st round pick in 2011 and a 3rd round pick in 2012 in exchange for Dustin Penner. It doesn't matter how Penner did in the regular season for the Kings. I didn't even bother to look it up, but I do know he had 11 points in 20 Stanley Cup playoff games in 2012 en route to the LA Kings' first ever Stanley Cup. Dustin Penner wasn't traded away from the Kings, so his little part of the trade tree ends there, but let's not bury the lead here. Something way down the line, decades later from the Gretzky trade, led to a Stanley Cup. It contributed in its own way, led to the Kings' first ever Stanley Cup victory. Now, in fairness, the deal didn't work out too bad for the Edmonton Oilers either. Colton Tubert, kind of disappointing, only a couple dozen games for the Oilers. The 3rd rounder they got, Daniil Zharkov, he hasn't played for them. The 2011 1st rounder the Oilers got in this deal, Oscar Klefbom. Not bad. Now wait though, I do have to put an important asterisk on Klefbom. This is the LA Kings side of the trade tree, okay? If the Oilers end up trading Klefbom, it's part of some sort of trade tree with the LA Kings, but it is not part of the Gretzky trade tree. Listen, we gotta have some rules. So now wait though, that was the 1st from Buffalo. The 3rd round pick the Kings got from Buffalo, follow the bouncing ball, because that 3rd rounder was the 74th overall pick in 2009. And the Kings traded it to the Calgary Flames in exchange for the 84th overall pick, that's another 3rd rounder, but later, and a 4th round pick, both in 2009, the 107th pick. That 4th rounder, the Kings would end up packaging it with another 5th rounder and sending it to the Florida Panthers in exchange for a 3rd rounder in 2010. And that 2010 pick was packaged with Ted Purcell and sent to the Tampa Bay Lightning for Jeff Halpern, who the Kings got for a little bit of leadership in a Stanley Cup run that ended up not resulting in a Stanley Cup. We got one more pick, the 84th overall pick in 2009. It's our only hope for continuing this, and it doesn't let down. Weird deal too. This 3rd round pick in 2009 was packaged with winger Hudson Fasching to the Buffalo Sabres in exchange for a 2nd round pick in 2015, a 2nd rounder in 2014, Jonathan Parker, and Braden McNabb. Now, Braden McNabb was a great young member of the LA Kings, played over 200 games there, but then was lost in the expansion draft to the Vegas Golden Knights. So, just to put it all in perspective, the Gretzky trade tree begins in 1988, and we're talking about a guy who is now on the Golden Knights. Jonathan Parker, no NHL games, okay. And the 2nd rounder in 2015, the Kings used to select Eric Cernak, who never played for the LA Kings because he was traded. The tree continues. We already talked about this in another video, the Chris Versteeg trade tree, actually. Cernak was packaged with goaltender Peter Budaj, a 7th round pick in 2017, and a conditional pick that was never met, and sent to the Tampa Bay Lightning in exchange for Ben Bishop and a 5th round pick in 2017. Now, the term cup of coffee is overused, but Ben Bishop was in LA for a cup of coffee. He played 7 games there. He ordered a coffee when he arrived, and it was still warm when he left. But when he left, he was traded to the Dallas Stars for the final trade of this tree for a 4th round pick in 2017. So now, I gotta tell you about 2 more people. The 5th round pick in 2017 that the Kings got from the Stars was used to select a player named Drake Reisma. He's still under contract with the LA Kings. And the 4th rounder that the Kings got for Ben Bishop was used to select a player named Marcus Phillips, another guy who is still under contract with the LA Kings. In fact, he is so young that he played with the London Knights last season. London Knights are in the OHL, by the way. So I waited all the way to the end to tell you this. One of the first questions my friends asked me when I was telling them I was working on this, is the trade tree, is the Wayne Gretzky trade tree from 1988 still alive? Yes. Yes, it is. Technically it is. If either of Drake Reisma or Marcus Phillips are traded, this thing goes on. And maybe one or both of those guys play a ton of NHL games, and then they're traded for guys who play 1,000 NHL games, and it goes on forever and ever. This thing may never end. Watch both of them get traded the second we upload this video. But ladies and gentlemen, you're not gonna believe this. That's it for the Wayne Gretzky trade tree. We're all caught up. We're done. But we learned a few things. Marty McSorley, that branch kept going and going all the way to leading the Kings to Dustin Penner, who helped them win the Stanley Cup in 2012. And the Kings still have two prospects, a 4th rounder named Marcus Phillips and a 5th rounder named Drake Reisma, who have the potential to keep the Wayne Gretzky trade tree from 1988 going. So, ladies and gentlemen, what did you think of that trade tree video? Holy cow. I really hope you liked that video. I gotta give a huge thank you to Sportsnet for letting us do these things. Producer Drew Livingstone, freelance editor Tom Flett, Tom Stewart, just unbelievable taking all my phone calls and doing notes on this thing and all the research, my goodness. And the biggest thank you goes to you. So that is it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. Click like if you like this video. Click subscribe if you really liked it. Tell all your friends to have a safe and happy holiday. And Marcus Phillips and Drake Reisma. I had it wrong the whole time, but I'm correcting it now. Drake Reisma. Watch. Both Phillips and Reisma are going to play like 2,000 games in the show. It's going to happen.